All right, welcome back. Here we're going to continue on process safety management. We did sections A, B, C, D. Now we're going to skip E, and I'll tell you why later. And this is F, operating procedures. The first one here. And we'll go over several of these. The employer shall develop and implement written operating procedures that provide clear instructions for safely conducting activities involved in each covered process, consistent with the process safety information, which we already talked about, and shall address at least the following elements. Now, these are written operating procedures that have to be done. Makes a lot of sense. You should have written operating procedures, even if you don't have highly hazardous chemicals. If you're just doing something you think is basic, got this, the guy off the street doesn't, he may be the next guy you're hiring. So this should be something that every company should have, every business should have. Steps for each operating phase. Now, not maybe these particular steps that are in here, but operating procedures, it's all about. But in process safety management, you have to have these steps for each operating phase: initial startup, normal operations, temporary operations, emergency shutdown, including the conditions under which emergency shutdown is required, and the assignment of shutdown responsibility to qualified operators to ensure that emergency shutdown is executed in a safe and timely manner. We always let any operator shut something down if it had to be. Emergency operations, normal shutdown, and startup following a turnaround or after emergency shutdown. Operating limits, consequence of deviation, and steps required to correct or avoid deviation, safety and health considerations, properties of and hazards presented by the chemicals used in the process, precautions necessary to prevent exposure, including engineering controls, administrative controls, and PPE. Where have you heard them before? Control measures to be taken if physical contact or airborne exposure occurs. Quality control for raw materials and control of hazardous chemical inventory levels and any special or unique hazards. So it covers a lot of things. Safety systems and their functions. Operating procedures shall be readily accessible to employees who work in or maintain a process. Okay. Operating procedures shall be readily accessible to employees who work in or maintain a process. Very important. You just can't write them, hide them. The operating procedures shall be reviewed as often as necessary to assure that they reflect current operating practice, including changes that result from changes in process chemicals, technology, and equipment, and changes to facilities. The employer shall certify annually these operating procedures are current and accurate. Now, this is a little different than a lot of other things. They say, oh, you have to do something annually, real common in OSHA. But in this particular thing, they have to be reviewed as often as necessary to assure that they reflect current practice, including changes that result in any changes you make. Reviewed as often as necessary. But they have to be certified annually that these operating procedures are current and accurate. We had a cover sheet on each one of our operating procedures and had somebody sign it. They certified that it was operating or was current and accurate. That's got to be done. Somebody has to current. I kind of like when OSHA does this, makes somebody put their name on something, rather than just say, yeah, it's okay. They say, wait, I'll put my name on it. I better make sure it's okay. That's the theory behind it, and it's pretty solid, I think. The employer shall develop and implement safe work practices to provide for the control of hazards during operations such as lockout, tagout, confined space entry, opening process equipment, or piping, control over entrance into a facility by maintenance, contractor, laboratory, or other support personnel. These safe work practices shall apply to employees and contractor employees. F4 is quoted later on too, and that's what they're talking about. Safe work practices are just kind of regular safe work practices required by OSHA, or some is required by OSHA, but they could be any kind of safe work practices. But they specify lockout, tagout, and confined space, that type of thing. So the employer shall develop and implement safe work practices. Should have that anyhow. That's pretty simple. Now you see that a lot of these chapters or sections by letter in process management are pretty short, but they require a lot of work. So the regulation itself is not very long, but what you have to do to comply with this regulation is pretty extensive. So this is G, training. You know there'll be training in here somewhere. This element has three main paragraphs: initial training, refresher training, and training documentation. And this, a lot of this stuff, again, this covers some of it applies to any training program, whether it's process safety management or not. All right, for each employee presently involved in operating a process and each employee before being involved in operating a newly assigned process shall be trained in an overview of the process and in the operating procedures as specified in paragraph F, which we just talked about, of this section. The training shall include emphasis on the specific safety and health hazards, emergency operations, including shutdown and safe work practices applicable to the employee's job tasks. These are my notes you read. Each employee, no exception. The training shall include emphasis on the specific safety and health hazards, emergency operations, including shutdown, and safe work practices applicable to the employee's job tasks. These safe work practices is all-encompassing and includes such training as lockout, tag, and hot works, etc., and anything else they might get into. In lieu of initial training for those employees already involved as of, I think this is here, as of May 26th, in operating a process on May 26th, an employer may certify in writing that the employee has the required knowledge, skill, and ability to safely carry out the duties and responsibilities as specified in the operating procedures. So you probably never need this, but I did once, and you should know about it. So that's it. Somebody's already been there since then at 92. You don't have to, you just have to certify in writing that they have all this stuff. Again, you got to certify in writing. Somebody's got to put their name on it. Refresher training shall be provided at least every 3 years and more often if necessary to each employee involved in operating a process to ensure that the employee understands and adheres to the current operating procedures of the process. The employer, in consultation with the employees involved in operating the process, shall determine the appropriate frequency of refresher training. So it's at least every 3 years in consultation with employees. Shall determine the appropriate frequency. Suggestion: every year, have each employee involved fill out a simple questionnaire with a checkbox saying that 3 years is adequate or inadequate, and if inadequate, what they feel they need to be trained in, how often. Oh, excuse me. So by this, you're getting their input into it. You're giving them a chance. Here's your chance. Just say that 3 years is adequate, or if it's not, okay, then what else do you think you need to be trained in? And how often do you think you need to be trained? Get their input. Always get employees' input about everything, just about, but this you do it in writing so you can show compliance with this paragraph. Training documentation. Each employer shall ascertain that each employee involved in operating a process has received and understood the training required by this paragraph. The employer shall prepare a record which contains the identity of the employee, the date of the training, the means used to verify that the employee understood the training. Okay, now this is kind of understood in most of OSHA. Some are more specific than others, but this one here says you have to make sure they have received it and understood the training. Remember, we talked about thing about communication earlier, and what communication. All right, me telling you that 1 1 plus 2 is not communication, but me making sure that you know it, asking you, hey, how much is 1 1? You say 2. Okay, now we've communicated. You've proved to me that you understood the training. And that's or understood the communication. Communication is a two-way street. Just somebody saying something is not communication unless that person understands it. So receive and understood the training. How to do that? Well, one way to do it is you can give them a test on it. Another way is you get a form on about it. You fill it. We had some forms in it. You fill it out, and the trainer fills it out, and we put what it is they're being trained on, and then they sign it. They understood and everything, and give them a test. So they identify the employee, date of training, and means to use to verify that the employee understood the training. Suggestions, okay, test for some training, an acknowledgement sheet signed by the employee and the supervisor. This identical language is used for contractors in the next section. Each employer must have documentation on file on each employee, either a file or a binder, and must be kept up to date. This is a lot of paperwork because this is a lot of stuff to do in here, but you got to do it, and it's worth it because the whole idea is to have your employees trained so you don't have problems. Process safety management, 1910 to 119H, contractors. I was kind of in charge of the contractors, and boy, it was a pain sometimes, at first particularly. But this element has 3 main paragraphs: application, employer responsibilities, contract employer responsibilities. The application, let's look at this first of all. This paragraph applies to contractors performing maintenance or repair, turnaround, major renovation, or specialty work on or adjacent to a covered process. Okay, on or adjacent to. So it doesn't mean they're actually working on your system, but if they're right next to it, then they come under this. Because why? Because if they're doing something right next to it, they can impact it, right? It does not apply to contracts providing incidental services which do not influence process safety, such as janitorial work, food and drink services, laundry, delivery, that type of thing. And that makes a lot of sense. Key concepts: on or adjacent to. On is pretty cut and dried. Adjacent to is open to a little bit of interpretation, but adjacent to, generally speaking, means what? Next to it, right? Exempts incidental services who might be adjacent to. So you might have a contractor, a janitorial service cleaning up around your ammonia system or whatever. That's okay. So the employer, when selecting a contractor, shall obtain and evaluate information regarding the contract employer's safety, performance, and programs. How to make the contractor pony up this in advance. Check their accident info with others with the same NAICS. Okay, I had every year, I had the contractors send me their OSHA summary, and it has their NAICS on it. And of course, I'd already have it on file. I had a spreadsheet with these contractors on it, and I'd look it up and see how their NAICS, how their OSHA rate compared with other people in their North American Industrial Classification System, to see if they were, let's say they were electricians, and for the OSHA rate for all electricians was 3.0 accidents, and they were at 6. Oh, wait a minute here, we got a problem. That's information that they have to provide by law, and they'll have to give it to you particularly, but if they don't, they wouldn't be a contractor. The employer shall inform contract employers of the known potential fire, explosion, or toxic release hazards related to the contractor's work and the process. So you got to let them know what could be dangerous. The employer shall explain to contract employees the applicable provisions of the emergency action plan required by paragraph N of this section, which we haven't got to yet. Paragraph N is emergency planning and response. So, in other words, contractors need to know what to do in an emergency. So, the employer shall develop and implement safe work practices consistent with paragraph F4, which I told you would come up again, to control the entrance, presence, and exit of contract employers and contract employees in covered process area. Paragraph F is operating procedures, and F4 says the employer shall develop and implement safe work practices for lockout and everything, all those other things. And these safe work contractors shall apply to employees and contractor employees. So that's where they're tying these together here. It's just your regular safe work practices that you're going to have most of these anyhow, I hope. The employer shall periodically evaluate the performance of contract employers in filling their operational obligation as specified in paragraph H3 of this section, which we're going to look at soon. But one of the ways I did that was I got their OSHA logs every year. The employer shall maintain a contract employee injury and illness log related to the contractor's work in process areas. This is an OSHA log, OSHA 300 log. In other words, you have to maintain one for their contractor's work in the process areas. It's not a big deal, that is. If you're filling out a lot of accidents for that contractor or your contractor, you got a problem, because contractors, they try to take shortcuts. So you got to watch them. Believe me, you do. The contract employer shall assure that each contract employee is trained in the work practices necessary to safely perform his or her job. So how do you do this? How do you know if they're trained them? You ask them? Yeah, they're going to tell you, of course. So we used to have to require them to get at least three documents of completed training documentation that they've done. We let them pick it, but at least we got it. We got some proof from them that they were doing some training. And you kind of can tell by their operation, the people themselves, the contract workers. The contract employer shall assure that each contract employee is instructed in the known potential fire, explosion, or toxic release hazards related to his or her job and the process, and the applicable provisions of the emergency action plan. So this falls on the contractor employer. But here's the paragraph from employer responsibilities, which I already talked about.
The employer shall inform contract employers. So, you're informing the contract employer, so the boss or whoever the guy is, of the known potential fire, explosion, or toxic release hazards to the contractor's work process. And then it's up to the contract employer to let their people know. And that makes sense. They're got to train their own people. The contract employer shall document that each contract employee has received and understood the training required by this paragraph. The contract employer shall prepare a record which contains the identity of the contract employee, the date of training, and the means used to verify that the employee understood the training. So the employer should require a sampling of this documentation to show it's being done by the contractor employer. The contract employer shall assure that each contract employee follows the safety rules of the facility, including safe work practices required by paragraph F4 of the section. There's F4 again. It says that the employer shall develop and implement safe work practices to provide for the control of hazards during operations such as lockout, confined space, opening, piping, control over entrance, etc. So there it is again. So that's a pretty big paragraph. The contract employer shall advise the employer of any unique hazards presented by their contract employer's work, or of any hazards found by the contract employer's work. There's two things here. The hazards presented by the contract employer's work, maybe they're doing some welding or something like that. It's a hazard. Yeah, they should know. And hazards found by the contract employer's work. So they might have encountered some hazards that you weren't aware of, or so they need to tell you that. The relationship between an employer and a contract employer should be very cooperative, and they should be communicating as much as needs to be done. And their goals here should be the same. All right. But again, what contractors do, contractors try to get the job done as quick as they can because they make more money that way. Nothing wrong with making more money, but they got to be safe too. And I had butted heads with contractors more than once, but I never had to do this, but I had the power to not allow a contractor to do any work of this work. If I would have absolutely banned them from it, I'm sure it would have stuck. Because what are you going to do if the safety guy says they can't come on? You let them on. There's a problem. Well, so, and I had, but I want to say I always won, but I always got to what I needed to get. I always got for the contract what I needed to get from them. So, and what we had, whenever we had a project, and sometimes this was a huge project, we had a big meeting with a lot of people and a couple of them. But usually, let's say, and this would happen sometimes. I'd get called on Friday afternoon. Oh, we're having some contractors come in this weekend. What are you doing? All right, so we'd set up a meeting on Saturday. So I'd go in Saturday morning. We'd get around the table. We'll talk about it. All right, and that would okay. We'd go over. We'd try to have a little diagram where they're going to be working. They know the exits and that type of thing. So you can do this for a small project pretty quickly. For a big project, would have a lot more preparation. So, but communication is important to contractors, and don't let contractors. They will try to get away with stuff. Believe me, don't let them. All right, pre-startup safety review. Now this is something you're not going to see anywhere else in OSHA. PSSR, and that's what everybody calls it, PSSR. Pre-startup safety review. Well, let's read it. The employer shall perform a pre-startup safety review for new facilities and for remodeled facilities when the modification is significant enough to require a change in the process safety information. Okay, new and modified facility, that's a no-brainer. Remember on the earlier paragraph, process safety information. You have to have all this technical information on every piece of equipment that you have. And you should have this even if it's not process safety, believe me. So if there's a change required in that, then you have to do a pre-startup. Pre-startup means what? Before you turn it on, before you start the process, you have to do the review. PSSR. The pre-startup safety review shall confirm that prior to the introduction of highly hazardous chemicals to a process, okay, prior to introduction, the next four is sub-paragraphs for this one, so they all have to be done. Construction and equipment is in accordance with design specifications. Somebody has to be very familiar with this equipment. Safety, operating, maintenance, and emergency procedures are in place and are adequate. And that could be a big task if there's a big change. For new facilities, a process hazard analysis has been performed and recommendations have been resolved or implemented before startup. And modified facilities meet the requirements contained in Management of Change Part L, which we haven't talked about yet. Okay, new facilities, PHA performed. We're going to talk in the next module about a PHA. It's pretty extensive. Now, we are all earlier talked about a PSA as a preliminary hazard analysis, but now we're talking about a PHA in process safety management called process hazard analysis. And it's real similar to some of the things we've already talked about in this course. PHA performed and recommendations resolved or implemented. Modified facilities meet the requirements of management change will be covered in paragraph L. Okay. Training of each employee involved in operating a process has been completed. Again, training is critical in PSM. It's critical in any operation, but it's more critical because in PSM, because why? You're dealing with highly hazardous chemicals. Mechanical integrity. This is usually abbreviated just MI. Okay. If you see that. So mechanical integrity. Paragraph J2 through J6 this section apply to the following process equipment: pressure vessels and storage tanks. Makes sense. Piping systems, including piping components such as valves. Every piping system has valves, pressure relief valves, that type of thing. Or relief and vent systems and devices. They didn't call that out separately. Emergency shutdown systems, controls, including monitoring devices and sensors, alarms, interlocks, and pumps. So that covers just about everything in a system. Written procedures. The employer shall establish and implement written procedures to maintain the ongoing integrity of process equipment. Written, very important. Training for process maintenance activities. The employer shall train each employee involved in maintaining the ongoing integrity of process equipment in an overview of that process and its hazards and in the procedures applicable to the employee's job tasks to assure that the employee can perform the job task in a safe manner. So the trained employees involved in maintaining the ongoing integrity of the process, basically your maintenance people, to some degree your operators too. An overview of that process and its hazards, the procedures applicable to the employee's job tasks. Inspection and testing. Inspections and tests shall be performed on process equipment. Doesn't say, okay, anything we talked about. Inspections and tests must be performed. And inspection and testing procedures shall follow recognized and generally accepted good engineering practice, RAGIGAT. So mainly your testing procedures and inspections are probably going to come from your owner's manual or your manufacturer's instructions or manufacturer's recommendations. Manufacturer's recommendation, you can and will be cited if you don't follow them. I have. But we have. The frequency of inspections and tests of process equipment shall be consistent with applicable manufacturer's recommendations and good engineering practices, and more frequently if determined to be necessary by prior operating experience. So manufacturer's recommendations must be followed or done more frequently, unless if prior operating experience indicates otherwise. In other words, it wasn't enough to keep things kosher, then they got to be done more often. So you can't just blame it on manufacturer's recommendations. The employer shall document each inspection and test that has been performed on process equipment. In other words, if you do an inspection and test, you document it. Pretty simple, right? Documentation shall identify the date of the inspection or test, the name of the person who performed the inspection or test, the serial number or other identifier of the equipment on which the inspection or test was performed, a description of the inspection or test performed, and the result of the inspection or test. Documentation. You hear this all the time in safety. If you didn't document it, you didn't do it. You got to document it. And why wouldn't you? I mean, come on. The employer shall correct deficiencies in equipment that are outside acceptable limits, again, defined by the process safety information in paragraph D of this section, before further use or in a safe and timely manner when necessary means are taken to assure safe operation. Now, you notice how they kind of build on stuff here. They go back to some of these things, process safety information, that type of thing, in other sections, and that makes a lot of sense. This is not a haphazard little bit regulations written. It's written as a whole, but they're broken down into sections for your convenience, so you can kind of look at each one. But it's as taken together. They have to be taken together as a whole to be effective. So, but this is necessary because, I mean, this is interesting. Correct deficiency before further use. Or sometimes like for instance, with forklifts, it doesn't give you this option or in a safe and timely manner. You got to correct the deficiency before you can use that forklift. But now they're saying they can use before further use or in a safe and timely manner when necessary means are taken to assure safe operation. So you can correct them tomorrow if you have to, but you got to make sure that necessary means have been taken to assure safe operation. That's going to depend on the situation. In the construction of new plants and equipment, the employer shall assure that equipment as it is fabricated is suitable for the process application for which they will be used. Appropriate checks and inspections shall be performed to assure that equipment is installed properly and consistent with design specifications and the manufacturer's instructions. So new plants and equipment suitable for the process application. And most of the time you buy you're buying it from somebody who's in the business. Checks and inspections installed properly, consistent with the design specification and the manufacturer's instructions. That's a lot of work to do here. Somebody's got to know what they're doing on this stuff. The employer shall assure that maintenance, materials, spare parts, and equipment are suitable for the process application for which they will be used. All right, that is the next few parts of the process safety management standard. As you can see, this thing is pretty extensive. I think it's a great standard because it does give you the guidelines to have a safe process that is going to be using highly hazardous chemicals. And highly hazardous chemicals can be very, very dangerous and lethal. So in the meantime, be safe. And doesn't want to end this thing. There we go.